am very grateful to see such a large and distinguished audience today. Thank you all for making time to join us for this discussion. I must also give sincere thanks to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, with whom the Peterson Institute is now partnering on some initiatives. I've had the opportunity to work closely with Ms. Chano, as she mentioned, on past programs. And our goal, to be blunt, is to raise again the profile of Japanese economy and U.S.-Japan economic relations in Washington and in the U.S., and do so in a positive way. Many of you will remember in the 70s and 80s, the profile was high, but not always positive. In the 90s into the early 2000s, the profile became lower and lower. And I think that it is important for the U.S. as well as Japan, and it's important for economic understanding that we try to have a strong substantive dialogue about what's going on in Abenomics and about what's recovery in the U.S. as well. So I'm grateful to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We are starting, as Ms. Chano mentioned, the high-level working group, which I am proud to co-chair with Ito Motoshige. And we will look forward to keeping you all aware of what we will be doing, I hope, through Sasakawa. I'm also very grateful to Professor Kawamoto Akira from Keio for taking the time. He has been a distinguished scholar and public servant at times, and it's very generous of him to introduce me. Let me try to justify you all coming out today by giving you, I hope, an analytic overview of where Abenomics is and where, in my opinion, it should be going. The title is an American view of Abenomics. This is a little bit misleading. It is not a typical American view of Abenomics. The typical American knows nothing about Abenomics. The typical American who has a view is someone who worked on trade disputes between U.S. and Japan 20 years ago and thinks they know about Abenomics. I am not the only one by any means, but it is, I think, still a little rare to have Americans who have a fair view of Abenomics. It's nice to be fair, but it's also intellectually important to be fair. Part of the reason I want us to try to be fair, and another word, I don't envy my translator, another word for fair in research is objective, is to try to look at the facts squarely. And I think for me it's important to do this because I spent many years as a very big critic of a number of policies pursued by past Japanese governments, by past leadership of the Bank of Japan. And I am very glad that I am now in the position of being a little bit of a cheerleader. That they are pursuing policies that I think are helping and that are ones that I and a number of colleagues, both Japanese and foreign, pressed for. Now, if it turns out these policies don't work, it will be, of course, a little embarrassing for me, but that's unimportant. If these policies don't work, it will be a missed opportunity for Japan. But what I'm going to argue today is that I think these policies are working, and that I think the priorities, even on structural reform, of the Abe government are broadly the right ones, but we need more of what they're prioritizing. We need them to pursue more of it, and I'll try to explain what that means. So everyone in this room, of course, is familiar with the Prime Minister's use of the famous image of 3 arrows. And all the discussion nowadays, such as Professor Kawamoto was working on, is about the third arrow, about structural, regulatory, microeconomic reform. And I think it's right that that's where the action is. But it's right because the other two arrows, the monetary arrow, the fiscal policy arrow, are already working and accepted. And I think I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but I think it is worth appreciating where we are on that. So, as our moderator kindly mentioned, I spent time on the policy board of the Bank of England, and I've previously been an advisor to central banks. And one of the things that was proven over the last several years, but especially during the US-European crisis, is that inflation expectations, how a public sets prices and wages and thinks about prices and wages, is very sticky. Sticky is a fancy technical economic term. It means that they don't change very much. We've seen this repeatedly. We saw this in the UK, where I counted on it in advocating for certain policies to expand QE, and I counted on the fact that this would not dislodge the inflation that people would come to expect, and that turned out to be right. And so I think when we look at how far prices have moved up in Japan on average overall, and we look at the fact we're talking about wage increases finally, I think it is extremely good progress in just a year, a little over a year, since the announcement of Abenomics, and less than a year since Governor Kuroda took over the Bank of Japan. I don't say that to be nice. I say that because it's true. You really could not expect much more than this in this amount of time. I think on the fiscal side, it is, of course, not as happy a story because there are harder choices to be made, but it is still a positive story because to me, what the Abe government has gotten right this time that briefly the Koizumi government got right, but most others have not since 1990. What they got right is that you want to combine permanent increases in the taxes with temporary public spending, and that there is a very clear distinction between these and that you're aware of it, and the public is aware of it. Now again, it's not perfect. I am well aware that there are people in the Diet of all parties and others who might want to stop the rise of consumption tax, the next step, for example. And I will come back to this later. But I do want to say that this idea, the fundamental commitment that the long-term path of Japanese budgets must be higher tax rates, and the spending has to be temporary, well-justified, like for earthquake recovery, not just permanent giving money to people. I think that basic principle is finally being executed by the politicians, and I think that deserves praise too. Another thing to be a bit American about it, and many of you in this room are familiar with the issue, so I won't overdo it, but there has been a recurring claim through the years that Japanese government, Ministry of Finance in particular, has wanted to drive down the value of the yen to take away demand from other countries. There certainly was a period, there have been times when this was the case, but as I think everyone in this room who follows this knows, since early 2004, under then Vice Minister Watanabe, the Ministry of Finance stopped intervening in the yen market. And except for 2 interventions after the earthquake in 2011, the Ministry of Finance has not unilaterally tried to change the exchange rate. I think this is very important. It's very important because not just to keep the Americans happy. I think it's very important because it is an important message for Japan's role and partnerships in Asia as well, that Japan has occasionally suffered in recent years because South Korea has manipulated its exchange rate. And both Japan and the US have suffered in recent years because China has aggressively manipulated its exchange rate. And it is important that instead of constantly trying to offset the other, we try to get to a situation where there's less and less of this. The other reason I bring this up is economic. Among a surprising number of people, including sophisticated people, both Japanese and Western, there is a belief that quantitative easing is really about driving down the exchange rate, not about domestic reflation. Let me be very clear. I'm sure the translator's getting this right, but let me be very clear. This is a false idea. It's false both in Japan and in other countries that have done serious quantitative easing. If you are a very small economy, like a Switzerland or a Singapore, that might be the case. But for a large economy, the primary effect of monetary ease, whether it's cutting interest rates or printing money, is domestic price level and domestic demand. We've seen this in the US. We saw this very clearly in the United Kingdom while I was there. The pound declined a huge amount in 2008 before we started quantitative easing. It fell by 25% trade weighted. And it had very little impact on net exports. And we still had to do quantitative easing even after the pound fell. We've now seen something very similar here in Japan, where obviously the yen moved a great deal prior to even the official start of true quantitative easing. It obviously has been helpful to exporters to some degree, but primarily to domestic prices and domestic expectations. And if you look at where there's been growth in Japan, it has not been from net exports. And even if you take out the huge imports Japan now must make for energy, it's still not really a net export story. I don't mean that Japan should never grow through exports. I hope it does. I just mean that people should be very clear quantitative easing, whether it's here in Japan, in Great Britain, in the US, when done by a large country, a large economy, excuse me, is about domestic policy, and it's very helpful for Japan and the rest of the G20 that's the case. You've been very patient, but having now given all that background, which I think is very important, let me turn for the remainder of my remarks to talking about the third arrow, structural reform. As Ms. Chano said, our last joint program at Peterson Institute was about the transition from these macro policy, fiscal monetary, to the micro structural policy. To repeat my main message, I commend the Abe government's program. Again, I'm not a politician. I would have happily commended Komeito or DPJ had they done the right thing before this. I commend the current government's policies on structural reform, not because they are enough, but because they are the right priorities. There is a tendency when talking about structural reform, and I know that term is well translated, is well known here as well as in US, Europe. There's a tendency to take what I call the laundry list approach, which is somebody from the OECD, as where Kawamoto Sensei used to work, or somebody from the IMF, or worst of all, somebody from the US government being obnoxious, comes along and says, here's my fantasy of how a perfect free market economy would work. Here is a long laundry list of 30 different ways in which your economy is not like that fantasy free market economy, and get to work on all of them. And the record of societies trying this and responding to this is not very good. There are all kinds of reasons you can imagine. In particular, there is simply, to use a current term, not enough bandwidth, usually. So you get broken down into this particular financial regulation at the same time you're doing this particular environmental regulation, at the same time you're doing this particular trade negotiation. And while, of course, ideally, the prime minister or the president or the executive of any democratic government can say to each ministry, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, and it will all happen. We all know, living here in Tokyo, that that's not how the world works. And living in Washington, I can assure you that is not how the world works. I think it's also important in a democracy that people are able to understand and monitor what a government's priorities are. And realistically, even your sophisticated voter is not going to sit there with this laundry list, this checklist, and see all of it. So where I give the Abe government at present credit on the third arrow is it seems to me they've identified roughly 4 big points, and they're arguably the right 4 big points. First, most important, is raising the participation of women in the Japanese workforce. I would hope by now that is a familiar idea to everyone in this room, but I will go back through why that is so important. Second, to reform agriculture. Third, to deal with some of the issues of what is now Japan's 2-tier labor market of permanent and temporary workers. And fourth, to increase competition in certain sectors, particularly healthcare. Now, there are a whole list of other things one could come up with, but I am quite comfortable believing that if sufficient progress is made on these 4, that will be enough. I'll explain what I mean by enough a little later. The issue of women in participation. Now, again, I worry I'm repeating for this audience things you know, but let us just keep it very simple. This is found money, okay? Leave aside the social justice argument, leave aside the fact that women should be well treated and should be equally treated, leave aside the social aspects, just on the economics. This is like you're digging in the ground and you suddenly find a big pool of natural gas, okay? In Japan, for a good 15 years, you've had approximate parity, equality in the number of women coming out of university and with various forms of training to men. And you have still had a situation in which by the millions, they are underemployed or not employed after their early 30s. Now, inherently, given childbirth, in almost every society, women will participate at a lower rate than men in work. But the gap between men and women in Japan is extremely high, especially given that there is no disparity in education, and especially given that it is a very rich country, and especially given that it is a democracy in which women have the vote. This is, economically speaking, found money. If every time someone says, the workforce in Japan is shrinking, we don't have enough people paying taxes, we don't have enough young workers, one said, there are, depending how you count it, 1, 5, 10 million women, arguably 10 million, probably a little high. Let's call it 5 or 6 million women who should be better employed in Japan. That takes away the aging problem and much of the fiscal problem immediately and for a long time. So what seems the Abe government to do? They have offered, I think, 2 useful programs. One, to increase the number of child care places, of nurseries, or however you want to call it. And 2, to make commitments legal in the government sector and voluntary in the corporate sector that more management roles have to go to women. This is actually a very good approach. This is an approach in line with most economic research. The IMF has done work on this issue specifically with regard to Japan. We had them speak about it at our event in Washington, and they would support this, as do I. The problem is the numbers are too small. So we are talking now about 100 or 150,000 nursery places. The number should be 2 or 3 times that. We're talking about getting management up to 30% female, middle management in these affirmative action programs. The aspiration should be 40, and it should be much more binding on the private sector. It may seem like I'm just picking the current numbers and bidding them up, but that's actually not what I'm doing. I'm picking the numbers that are realistic to make a meaningful difference and finding that the current numbers are too small. Similarly, we can talk about agriculture. Now, agricultural reform is a funny issue because almost every country is terrible at it. And yet every country is convinced it's special. So the US walks around and tells people, you know, you have to reform, you have to open up your borders and let in our efficient, great agriculture. But then when poor countries come and say, we want to sell you sugar. The U.S. says, no, 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 we can't let you do that. And this is shameful, this is bad. Similarly, whether it's the U.S. or others, countries walk around and say to each other, you know, you are a northern temperate climate. Rice generally grows well in southern or equatorial wet places. Why are you growing rice? And you can say much the same thing for the U.S. We are growing rice in California, which is an enormous waste of water. Probably not as big a waste of water as golf courses, but a lot. So it's very easy to get into these sorts of games. And then in turn, on the other side, each country says, not just Japan, my rice, my beef, my milk is special. There's just nothing to be said about this. It is a pure form of theft. It is theft from the working people in all our societies that we charge them too much for food. And it is theft from the poor people of the world who don't get to export their crops, which they're capable of growing cheaply, to the rest of us. And we should not pretend it's anything but that. It is a form of theft. And so the Abe administration has, to some degree, volunteered to do more agricultural reform than previous Japanese elected governments have. And to make this stick, they have volunteered to join the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which is very important for a bunch of other reasons, but I won't go into that today, except in questions maybe. But part of that is, the hope is that will lock in some agriculture reform, because the Americans and the Australians will come down and say, you need to open this, this, and this. I've also heard from some officials, they sort of whisper, it's okay. If we can just wait 3-5 more years, all the farmers will be too old to farm anyways, and we can take it all back. And there is a certain point to this that's actually true. But here again, it's as with the women in the workforce. The aspiration is just too low. It's still theft. It's still a horrible tax with the money going to the wrong people. It's still literally taking food out of the mouths of Japanese poor people and foreign poor people. And there's just no excuse. If someday, God forbid, you know, you can tell stories about blockades and terrible things like that, there are much better ways of getting around that than wasting your money for decades on inefficient agriculture. Third, there's the labor market. One of the things I've learned over the last few years, again, not just about Japan, is that labor market problems, labor market institutions, as well as problems, are not solely the result of regulation. So this has been very interesting. If you look at studies of working population and worker rules, Japan, Great Britain, the US, all are listed as among the most liberal, the least regulated labor markets in the world, and that's right. It's true. You know, compared to France, compared to Greece, compared to Brazil, compared to India. And yet, what we've seen in recent years, not just in Japan, is the emergence of some unhealthy barriers to free employment without regulation. So in the US in recent years, what we've seen is a very big penalty for people who lose their job. That in theory in the US, in a free labor market, if you lose your job, it might be your fault, it might not be your fault, or even if it was your fault, you might have learned something from it. And ideally, you go out and you get another job. And it shouldn't, it should be maybe one factor among many when someone wants to hire you, whether you've been lost a job before. And what we found in this big recession and over the last several years is that has gotten very extreme, that if you're out of work for more than a few months, it becomes extremely difficult in the US to get another job. And there's no law that was passed, there's no change in regulation or accounting or anything like that, it just emerged. Similarly, it's not the same thing, but a similar kind of process, as many of you know, in Japan there has emerged this two-tier labor market where there are the people with so-called permanent jobs at established companies, not necessarily large companies, but established companies. And there is a large number of people, particularly younger people, who have temporary work assignments and don't have all the protections to go with those jobs. And again, there's been no extreme new regulation. It's not as though unions have suddenly become powerful again in Japan to create this market. It just has kind of emerged. But just as with the unemployment in the US, this is a real problem. This is a difficulty of people getting trapped in one part of the labor market, of the people in the temporary market not getting paid enough, of the permanent workers behaving to try to protect their permanent status. It's not a good outcome. And I actually commend the Abe government for realizing that even though this isn't something where they can, like Germany did 10 years ago, say, we have this generous rule, or the unions are too powerful, we can just do this and fix it. You're not going to be able to do that here. But that they're taking this on, and it's my understanding that a lot of this proposed special economic zones will be in part to take this on. I think, again, it's the right idea, it's not enough. That you need a much more aggressive intervention to deal with this. There are models from Europe of what are called active labor market policies to try to break down these insider-outsider problems. There are subsidies in taxes the government can do to encourage hiring of younger or less experienced workers. There is right now the law that, I believe, if I understand correctly, after 5 years, someone who's been a temporary employee at a given firm has to be made a permanent employee. That could be changed to 3 years. There should be more. What's the final area in which there should be more? And I don't want to take too long, so I'll be quicker with this. We need more competition in healthcare, in related services in Japan. This is particularly true because of the aging society, but not only for that reason. Now, it's not quite a joke. There's a famous saying. In Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, the opening is, all happy families are the same, every unhappy family is unhappy for its own reason. Or that's approximately the opening. And I've always believed this applies to healthcare. The very few countries where healthcare is right, they generally have a very efficient single-payer system and then very high competition for the parts of the system that are not officially single-payer, and so on. But countries that have it wrong, which includes the US, have it wrong in a multitude of different ways. Japan doesn't have it as wrong as the US does. Frankly, nobody has it as wrong as the US does. But we do have a society in Japan that has increasing need for health care at a reasonable cost, and where the availability of healthcare services is quite limited and is not responding to market demand. And I think this is another place where reform is necessary and where, again, to their credit, I think the Abe government understands this is a good place to put their efforts. So to repeat, I think it's important that you don't do the laundry list of structural reform and spend all your energy on every possible thing that you could possibly do. I think it's also important not just to wave your hands and say structural reform is good. You have to have something specific. So I give credit to Abenomics' third arrow because it has picked a few really important areas that I think are arguably the right ones, or certainly 4 of the top 6 or 7. But they are not sufficiently ambitious in what they're doing in each area. So let me turn back for a moment, and I'll conclude here about how I understand Abenomics, its motivation, and how that relates to sort of the fiscal arrow and the future of Japan. Now, particularly for an audience that comes to Sasakawa Peace Foundation, this may be very obvious to you, but I think it's underappreciated outside Japan, and it has to be made clear. The motivation for Abenomics is not about making Japan richer. It's not about finally making Japan efficient. It's not even about paying the fiscal bills. The motivation for Abenomics, as made clear by the Prime Minister, by the Deputy Prime Minister, by others, is the need for Japan to be able to play a strong role in setting up Asian order in the coming decades, which of course is a nice way of saying the need for Japan and its neighbors not to be dominated by China. And this national security motivation, which I hope and believe isn't about purely defense or military, but is about Japan being a strong ally to the US and to its neighbors, and thereby making a world where countries other than China have a say in what happens in Asia, is the true motivation for Abenomics. And I think this is right in both senses. I think it is right that Japan can only be a good ally, a strong, a vital, in English we say vital in 2 senses, vital, lively, energetic, and vital as in critical, as necessary, can only be a vital in both senses ally to the US and to its neighbors in the Pacific if it has a growing, functioning, and liberal economy. And I think it is right that this is a legitimate motivation to do economic reform. I am not here encouraging visits to Yasukuni Shrine. And I'm sad that I have to say that, but I have to say that. That's not what I mean. What I mean is I want a strong, open, unafraid, and attractive Japan that can be a partner to the US and its neighbors in the region. And it needs a strong economy to do that, and the Abe administration is right to make that connection. And if you think back through history, including Japan's history, including Meiji, the desire to have a country able to stand up for itself is usually a much stronger motivation for economic reform than any simple economic motivation of simply we want to be a little richer. One could argue that even for China that has partly been the case. So this brings us back to where I started, which is to say, for all the right priorities in the third arrow, for all the success in the first and second arrows, the Abe government is being insufficiently ambitious. If this is truly the Abe government's motivation, and they understandably believe there is a limited window of time in which to achieve this, not tomorrow, but less than 10 years, then putting it crudely, Japan needs a sustained growth rate of GDP on average of at least 1.75%, and it needs a consumption tax rate by the end of the next 5 to 10 years of 20%. And it's only going to get to both of those if it does more of what it's starting to do now. The direction is right, but the government, in my opinion, should be more ambitious in its direction, going in this direction. I'll close by saying it was my privilege, among many others, to hear Prime Minister Abe speak in Davos last month. And he gave a very well-received, deservedly well-received speech. And he spoke about being the drill bit that would drill through special interests in Japan to get the right outcome. And again, I'm not a politician. I don't care who says this. I'm glad someone did. If you're the drill bit, you don't bother setting up this huge machine with this diamond-tipped drill to go through this much of the wall. You set up the huge machine with the expensive diamond tip drill bit and the big energy behind it because you're really drilling somewhere. I think it would be very good to see the Abe government drill somewhat further. Thank you very much.